Marginal Gains listeners and Marginal Gains TV viewers, wow, I have a special one today. This one has been a couple weeks in the making, and I think that in light of all of the Everesting that everyone has been doing and talking about, you are going to really love this interview today with the man who started bicycle Everesting, George Mallory. George, it is such a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, Josh.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. So in researching you, I was just, fascinated. You've had this amazing kind of mountain climbing background. Like myself, you become an engineer. And then at some point in your life, you become, I would say, a bit obsessed, I feel like is a fair word, with climbing on a bicycle. So I guess let's start a little bit back at the beginning. It sounds like kind of high school when you discover climbing. And I think some of our listeners will probably know, but you have you have a very famous climbing relative as well.
Well, let me try and answer that. First of all, I'm really not an accomplished mountaineer, even though, yes, I have climbed Mount Everest, but really beyond that, I'm not very experienced or accomplished. And yes, my grandfather was George Mallory, the man who attempted to climb Everest in the 1920s and died in the attempt. But I guess I take the view that I like to be proud of my own achievements, and being your grandfather's grandson isn't necessarily an achievement. I think you'll agree. I started rock climbing at high school, and after a few years became very keen indeed. And when I went to university in Johannesburg, to the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS as it's called, I joined the mountain club there and became very keen on rock climbing.
And so in some of the reading I did, it sounds like it was rock climbing where maybe I'll call them some of your crazier ideas began to form. This five climbs in 24 hours. I mean, these sorts of things. So, how did that come about? What was the impetus there?
Yes, indeed. Well, let me think. How did this happen? One of the best places for rock climbing, as far as I was concerned, was in the Transvaal, which is where I lived. It's called the Blouberg. It's in the northern Transvaal, about 4 hours drive north of Johannesburg. And the thing that made it very special to us was that it's about 1,000 foot high. So it took a full day or more to get one climb done in the beginning. But after a few years of learning the lie of the land, my friend Kevin Smith and I decided that we would try and do 2 routes in the same day. And when we actually set about doing this in December many years ago, we actually climbed a lot faster than we thought and did 3 in a day. Okay. And then a few months later, Kevin said to me, well, George, we should try to actually do more than 3 in a day. I didn't believe him at first because I'd done the maths. I could do maths. And I'd worked out that if each of the 3 routes had taken us 5 hours as a round trip, there weren't 25 hours in the day, because Kevin wanted to do 5 routes in 24 hours. Okay. 5 in 24, it just wouldn't go. And you'd have to climb at night. So I regarded that as just completely impossible. But Kevin persuaded me, and over a course of about 18 months, we went up there frequently, and we learned to, walk up in the dark at night, and then we learned to rock climb with head torches at night, and we learned the 5 easiest climbs on Blouberg, all of which were of a grade of about grade 20 in the Australian grading system, which I think is about grade 5.9 or maybe easy 5.10 in the American system. You learned to climb those in the dark, and eventually when we were ready in March 1989, we went up there and we did the big push, which is what we called it. But just to explain to your listeners where we got the idea from, there's an extremely accomplished and famous American rock climber called John Long, and he wrote an article in about 1984-ish, somewhere around there, called The Only Blasphemy. It's a fabulous story, and what it's all about is how him and his colleagues climbed multiple rock climbs at Joshua Tree, you know where that is in Southern California, in order to make up the elevation gain of El Capitan, which they couldn't climb in winter. And so Kevin and I had the idea when we did the big push that we were actually doing what we thought of as being an El Capitan day at Bloberg. So when I, a few years later, just to move forward a few years, in 1992, late December 1992, when I first rode my bike up Mount Everest, I might just add that I wasn't really what anybody would call a bike rider then. I was on my commuter mountain bike. They weighed a ton. I rode up Mount Everest and it was absolutely fabulous. And within a couple of weeks, I got the idea that I could try and do a Mount Everest day in Melbourne by riding 8 laps of Mount Everest. So that was way back in early 1993. I quickly went out and bought a half-decent road bike. It was a Trek 1200. But I mean, by today's standards, it was pretty heavy and had a big frame fit pump and it weighed a ton. But within about a month of first discovering Mount Everest, which is about an hour and a half's drive out of Melbourne, I'd done 4 laps in a day. Of course, got to the end of that and was absolutely thrashed.
And you kept going, right?
Well, I enjoyed it because it got me out of town, it got me into nature. It's a mild gradient hill all the way up the mountain. When I say mild, it averages out at about 6.5%, something like that. It's got one steep pinch in the middle, which reaches about 10% fairly briefly. There are, this eucalypt forest cover and tree ferns, and it's really beautiful on a warm day. And so I really enjoyed it, and I started to make it a mission to see if I could ride the 8 laps, which I thought at the time would get me the 8,800 meters, which mind you is a little bit short of 8,848 meters, but I thought that was near enough. But I mean, it was really hard. I mean, I was, as I said, not really a cyclist. I was really just a guy with a bike. And somewhere along the line, I'd managed to set out on a rainy day, and I rode up in the drizzle. Of course, riding uphill in the drizzle, you're going slowly and you're generating a lot of warmth and heat. So that was all right, but coming down the mountain was not all right. Yeah. And I got extremely cold. So that tended to slow me down a bit, my attempts. And of course, in winter, well, I'm saying of course, but you don't really know. In winter, it's not really feasible to ride laps on Everest. You can ride 1 lap, and I have, but you have to carry a backpack with gloves and warm gear just to do the descent. So really, I waited until the next summer and tried again. And I think by the time I was invited to climb Mount Everest in February 1994, I'd managed 7 laps. Okay. Which is a lot, but it doesn't give you the Mount Everest. Right. And so once I had been invited to climb Mount Everest by an American group, very very experienced and very well prepared American group with great values. That I'm really grateful for that and remain grateful for their values. By then the pressure was on, and so during the winter I trained by walking up a hill with a backpack on for more specifically mountaineering training. But I also wanted to do the Mount Everest day in Melbourne, partly because it's also brilliant training for mountaineering. Yeah. I'd by then been to the Himalaya once, and I knew from that first experience that in all earnest, too much stamina is never enough. Right. So, well,
No such thing, right?
there's no such thing as too much stamina in the mountains,
Yeah.
especially in the Himalaya. So once the weather warmed up in October, I set off very early from home and went out and tried to ride the 8 laps, and I managed to get the 8 laps done. It took me about, I can't remember, 17 hours or something, starting before dawn, finishing at twilight. And by the time I got home from that 8 lap session, I started to think, well, actually, you know, maybe I did actually have a little bit of energy left at the end. And so maybe I should really try for something even bigger, because it was only October and I was scheduled to leave Melbourne to go to Kathmandu in February. So I still had a few months to, to finish off my training. And the next month, in the full moon, of course, you need to time these things with the full moon so that you can,
right,
in the true spirit of marginal gains, so that you could leave your battery powered headlight in the car so you don't have to carry it up. And so I went out there in the full moon in November. I think it was mid-November, after work on a Friday. Started riding at 9:30. Managed to get 10 laps done by twilight the next day on the Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Now the 10 laps, I think it gave me 340 kilometers of riding. At the time, I thought it was 11,000 meters of climbing. It's actually a bit less than that, because we now know with GPS that the elevation of Dona Buang is not 11,000 meters, it's about 10,800. It's about 1,084 meters. So when I rode the 8 laps, the 10 laps, I got 10,840 meters, and it took me about 22 hours and 45 minutes, something like that.
Yeah.
And I was pretty damn happy with that.
Yeah. I would be. I was
pretty happy with that. And actually, what is a little bit interesting, I suppose, if I can say this, is that at that stage, there was some interest in George Mallory's grandson, me, going to climb Mount Everest. And so I realized that there might well be some interest in my story if I did manage to climb Mount Everest. And being an engineer, civil engineer by profession, my ability to write English was limited. Josh, you might be able to relate to this, probably you can't, but I thought that I needed some practice, and I wrote the story, the full story of how I rode the 10 laps on Mount Dona Buang, because it was actually quite a long story. I'd been out there, tried long and hard, and the story I wrote kind of sat on my hard drive for many, many years, until after I got back from Everest and I got back into cycling. I might just say, as an aside, that it took many years before I was brave enough to go back out to Mount Dona Buang. Well, frankly, because the memory of the suffering and pain was very well embedded in my psyche. And when I did go back out there, the friend of mine here in Melbourne, who had initially pointed me to Mount Dona Buang as a good place to ride a bike, he asked me about those early bike rides, and I thought, well, there's a much easier way to do this. I would send him the article, which I did, and it didn't take him long to send the article to the Melbourne-based cycling, web-based cycling magazine, Cycling Tips. And long story short, they published it pretty promptly, which I must say wasn't really my idea, but I acquiesced and went along with it. And within a few days, the comments on it they were beyond my belief, that's for sure. Yeah. And that was in 2012. And by then I was already on Strava, and I was by then a pretty keen cyclist, as distinct from a rock climber. Rock climbing had kind of gone by the wayside, gone by the way for me, partly because in Melbourne the access to rock climbing is actually quite far away from Melbourne. So I was becoming a much more keen road cyclist. And also by then, by the time the Cycling Tips article was published, my brand of cycling that I was good at, and so I did it mostly, was hill climbing. And I had by then already made for myself a spreadsheet of all the hill climbs I'd ever done here in Melbourne and also in the French Alps and the Italian Dolomites. I've then ridden Monte Zoncolan, Alpe d'Huez, and so on and so forth. And my spreadsheet, instead of like you might do on conventional flat road bike riding, instead of tracking average speed or elapsed time on a particular flat segment, it was all about rate of ascent. How could I get a better average rate of ascent? How could I get a better average ascent, rate of ascent for a bigger climb? Obviously, it's better to get a strong, fast rate of ascent on a big climb than on a small climb. And I had this spreadsheet. It was pretty massive, and I had every single climb on it. And I'd by then worked out that I'm not exactly sure how this works. Perhaps you can help, but basically what I worked out is that you are able to get a faster rate of ascent on a steeper gradient. And I think that works because you go slower on a steep climb, so there's less rolling and wind resistance. And also when you're on a steep climb, there's no temptation to slack off. You have to keep pedaling.
That's a great point.
Absolutely, brick hard. Well, you can't get lazy on a steep climb, because if you do, your cadence drops and therefore your power delivery drops. And so on a very steep climb, you have to keep the pedal to the metal every inch of the way. So as soon as the Cycling Tips article broke, and by the way, just one of the comments on the bottom of the article is, if it ain't on Strava, it never happened. Now, I know the comment was meant as a joke, but at least I assume it was. But I mean, I thought, well, actually, really, Strava's fantastic, because the thing I really love about it is that you can let your bike rides do your talking. You don't have to publish yourself. People want to follow you, that's fine. And if they don't, that's also fine. But you don't have to go and tell them what you're doing. No. They can see what you're doing if they want to see it. And I thought, well, actually, how to say this? In mountaineering, there are any number of stories about climbers who claim to have climbed a summit, but they get back down without any photographic evidence. Now, I'm not going to say which ones I believe and which ones I don't, but how it relates to cycling and Strava is that if you've posted an Everest bike ride on Strava, then people can go and have a look at your file and they can see that you've done it. You don't have to claim that you've done it.
Right.
And hope that people believe you. I mean, so I thought, it's a really good idea to go and, put one down on Strava. And so, as soon as it was summer, the weather was suitable, I went out and rode 8.5 laps of Donna Buang, which was enough. Remember when I first did the Everest day in Melbourne, it was 8 laps. That was actually a little bit shy of the required 8848 because of historic GPS reasons and whatnot. So I rode the 8.5 laps and I got it done in 15 hours. Now I was pretty happy with that. Actually, I had to. I got it only on my second attempt because on my first attempt a few weeks earlier, I broke a spoke at 6,600 meters.
Oh, that's so painful.
Well, it was annoying, but I tidied up the spoke and freewheeled down the hill, but that put an end to my attempt. So I went back a few weeks later and got the 8.48 by 8.5 laps of Donna Buang. And I thought, well, great. And I posted it on Strava and I was delighted. I think I said something like, over Mount Everest in 15 hours, something like that. And I was pretty happy with it. But the story doesn't end there, because a few months later, I was transferred to Christchurch, New Zealand for work. And New Zealand, Christchurch anyway, has a lot of hills.
Yeah, beautiful.
And over the weekend, I started exploring them, and I got to think, well, I should try to go faster than 15 hours because, well, Donna Buang is great. It's very beautiful, but it's not suboptimal in the sense that the descent takes around about 17 minutes.
Oh,
and
wow.
after the first couple of minutes, it's really a waste of time. You've recovered, you've got your breath back, and that's really wasting time. And the rate of descent on a 6.5% gradient is actually not great because you're doing about 60 kilometers an hour, which is fine, but on a 6% gradient, well, let's just put it this way. You can do a lot better. You can do twice as well if you are freewheeling down at 60 kilometers an hour, down a 12% gradient.
Yeah.
It's just max.
Yeah.
So I knew I would need to find a steeper hill and one with a more flowing descent. And I picked one that I thought would work for me. It was about a 400-meter tall hill with an average gradient of about 9%. And when I was ready, I went and hit it, and I got it done in, I can't remember the numbers, 13 and a half hours, 13 hours, 15 minutes. So an NCAT's a lot faster, which was very encouraging. This is great. And so sometime around then, the cycling club here in Melbourne called Hells 500 started developing a bit of an interest in the concept of Everesting, and started discussing with me how they were going to try and launch this thing, which they did. And around about at the time they launched, I had found an even better hill, which was also about close to 400 meters tall, but the descent was much more flowing. It wasn't nearly as messy as Mount Pleasant Road that I'd used before. And so I went out there and I got that done in 12 hours 35, which was significantly faster. And I was well pleased. But by then I'd sort of become, as you mentioned earlier on, Josh, I don't know if I should be embarrassed about this or not, but I was by then really fairly obsessed with these Everesting bike rides.
Yeah.
And I just knew that, a lot of it was about fitness, but actually a lot of it was about finding a hill that was kind of closer to optimal. And so I identified an even better hill, which was called Port Levy. And I bought an 1130 cassette on my 10-speed bike. And the average gradient on Port Levy is about 11%. But actually it's got a pretty steep pinch somewhere in there. And I think the height of the hill is about 300 meters or so.
Okay.
And there's a bit of a hairpin bend in the middle, so you have to sort of hit the brakes halfway down. Doesn't matter. And I went out there and I got that done in 11 hours and 8 minutes. And
just amazing. I think for most people, one of these is more than enough, right? And you just keep going back and back and back. It's so impressive.
Yeah, I must say I'm not a psychologist, you understand, but the thing is that I guess I took the view that, you do need to prepare for things. You do need to perfect them. You can't reasonably expect to go out there and do your best on your first attempt. I really do think that.
Yeah.
You do need to bang away at it and try and perfect and perfect. And with Everesting, I mean, there are so many variables that you can perfect, ranging from equipment, which is largely about weight and weather and the hill that you're on, and training and resting before, and food choices and all that sort of thing. Not that I'm an expert on food choices, I can assure you of that. But sometime after the Port Levy ride, I bought a better bike, a slightly lighter bike with an 11-speed system. And then winter came along and I went off to Europe to do my bike riding holiday as usual, where I'm pretty sure I probably rode Monte Zoncolan somewhere in there. And when I got back, it was July in Christchurch. And after about a week of resting, I rode another hill I had identified, which was a lot steeper. It was averaged about 16%.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, 16% is the real deal.
That's, yeah.
And
that's not messing around right there.
Yeah, but much. Yeah. Oh, yeah. 16%. You know, is what I call steep if you're riding it all day. And but a much shorter hill. I think it's about 90 meters tall.
Okay.
From memory. And by then I'd bought an 1132 cassette, which paired nicely with my 3450 compact crank. And basically, I set about writing it, and I got it done in 10 hours and 12 minutes.
Wow.
I must say, which was close to an hour faster than the previous one. I must say, one of the things that I remember is that I'd prepared a set of split times, of course, based on my rate of ascent from the previous ride, and they were just useless. You know, from about 1 hour into the 10-hour ride, my split times were just dead weight on my top tube. You know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was extremely difficult. I mean, towards the end, you know, approaching the top of the hill, which is where the steepest part of the climb was, you had to really mentally dig deep to get it done. So great. I'd ridden 10 hours and 12 minutes. I think at the time it was not the fastest, but it was up there. You know, it was nothing to be embarrassed about. So I kind of felt a little bit as though I'd sort of achieved what I wanted to in Everesting, and one of the things I wanted to do was to demonstrate to myself and anybody who might be interested that I was a proper bike rider. I wasn't just a guy who wrote an article about riding 10 laps of Donna Buang for the sake of, you know, getting a bit of attention, so to speak. I don't know if my explanation there will, you know, something that listeners will understand. But I definitely didn't want to be, you know, be seen as a narcissist in that sense. So anyway, right about then, I came home to Melbourne. And I guess by then I'd probably developed delusions of grandeur. And I wanted to see if I could break the 10-hour barrier on Everesting. And I'd selected a hill here in the outer east of Melbourne called Hughes Street. Just as a bit of an aside, it's fairly close to the hill that Tobias Lestrel was later to use to set the world record that he held for 3 years. It's quite close to, it's called Terry's Avenue, where Tobias rode. Anyway, and Hughes Street is about a 12.2% average gradient, about 114 meters tall, and it's got one kink in the middle, but I'd managed to practice it enough that I knew I could manage to get through the kink halfway down without using my brakes, and it was a very rapid descent. And yeah, I went out there with high hopes, and because I had planned and hoped to do it in 10 hours, I started, you know, after first light. But I wasn't on a good day for whatever reason. I don't know. I was just not feeling good, and by the time I'd ridden 2,000 meters, I was really not feeling good at all. And I thought to myself, well, you know, stuff happens. I'll see if I can get 4,000 done and call it a day. Good training. I'll come back in a few weeks' time when I'm feeling better. And somewhere around the 4,000 meter mark, there was some guy who was doing his gardening, and he shouted out to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm trying to ride Mount Everest." He says, "Oh, good luck, you know."
Right. You're a little far away.
In the sort of classic, in the classic Aussie way. I don't know if he knew what it was or what it wasn't, but just to kind of go back in time, I'd always done all my Everesting rides unsupported, just driven to the base in my car I had all the water bottles and food in my car, and that's how I did it. That's how I've always done it. But for some reason, this strange fact that one person in the world knew that I was attempting an Everest ride. I don't know, it somehow got to my head, and I thought, well, now I've got to box on and see if I can finish it. And I got to 6,000 meters. And Josh, if you haven't done it, I'm telling you now, by the time you've got 6,000 meters in your legs, and you've got to do another 3,000 meters, life gets very difficult.
Yeah.
But I somehow managed to box on, and twilight came, so I had to stop and put my lights on my bike, which was not part of the plans. That delayed me a bit. But I mean, I did at least finish it, which is what I was proud of doing, even though my time was a lot slower than I had in my delusions of grandeur. Set for myself, you know, I got it done in 10 hours 52, which I mean is hardly shabby. I was nearly 54. It's not too shabby, but I started to. I must say, by the time I'd done that, the novelty was starting to wear off, so to speak. But there was one more that I still wanted to do, and that was Mount Everest. Now, you won't know, but a lot of your listeners and viewers in Australia will know that Mount Everest is a whole category climb. It's here in Victoria. It's about a 2.5-hour drive east from Melbourne, and it's probably the most difficult whole category climb in Australia. It averages about 11.5%, but even that doesn't really do it justice, because there are a couple of flat points along the way. So the 11.5% hides the fact that there are some very steep pitches in it. And for that reason, I wanted to ride Everest on Ball. Got no idea why, but that's my story. So when I was ready in December and the weather was warm, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and got in the car and drove out there and started just before first light in the dark with no head torch, with a view to doing the first descent at first light, which I did. And I had a set of split times for Ball with a view to getting it done in, I think my target for Ball was 11 hours 30 minutes. And as I recall, my target for Ball, the 11 hours, 30 minutes, was based on some completely garbage metric. It was something like, if I had managed to get 11 hours, 30, I would beat the next guy on the list. If you ranked all the climbs on elapsed time on the Everesting Hall of Fame, that would give me 4 Everestings in the top 20 or something like that. There was something like that. So there was some completely garbage, meaningless metric which was driving me to get in under the 11.5 hours. And I had a set of split times, and I aimed to stop at my car on every second lap. And I mean, in the spirit of marginal gains, I mean, I'll just give you a sense of this. I had taped to the top bar of my bike my car's remote central locking thingy, so that as I got to the car, I would hit the unlock button, dump the bike on the grass, open the back of the car, get into the water and the juice and the gels and the biscuits and the chocolate and everything else, scoff it down as quickly as I could, slam the car closed, hop on the bike, hit the remote, carry on to my next lap. So every 2 laps, which is about 1,500 meters of climbing. One break in 1,500 meters of climbing is, I think you'll agree, is suboptimal. Never mind, that's what I did. And it got very hot during the day. There was no wind, and there's a pitch of about the gradient gets up to about 15% or something. And I was suffering monumentally. I really suffered. By the time you've got about 8 of 12 laps of Donnabuing under your belt, life gets very difficult. Everything hurt. But I managed to keep going, and I got it done in, I think, 11 hours and 17 minutes. But I was done with Everesting already. for me, the quantum of, yep.
Yeah. For context, like how at this point, so this is what, your eighth attempt?
Okay, that was my eighth Everesting, if you include the 10 lap, original
the
Donna
big one.
Boeing, and the big one, and then the 7 ones on Strava. So that was my eighth Everesting, my eighth and final Everesting. I think for me that ship now has sailed, as they say. But so I was a couple of weeks shy of 55 then. And so a couple of weeks later, when I got into the new Strava age group.
I see where this is going.
I really do need to be embarrassed about this, but I was thrilled with getting into a new Strava age group, because you can filter out all the guys who are younger and fitter than you are. You don't need to compete with them, just compete with them. Yeah, the middle-aged guys. And I must say, for me, it was a lot easier to look good on Strava in the 55 to 64s than just, on the open market. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Josh, it's not the best reason, for going out and cycling. It really isn't. But I mean, for me, it did provide motivation. And I think actually because for some kind of weird reason that I don't really understand, instead of pouring my energy into these really huge bike rides, Everesting and so on, that really are very big bike rides, somewhere along the line in that mix, I'd also ridden the La Marmotte course in France, which I really enjoyed. Some of your viewers will know the La Marmotte course, which does 3 big HC climbs, finishing on L'Alpe d'Huez. But the thing is that if the only thing you ever aim to do is these very long endurance rides, it doesn't necessarily make you faster on the shorter uphills. And so I started to focus on getting the age group comms on individual hill climb segments here in Melbourne, of course, in the local hills on Mount Everest, any and every HC climb in Victoria, and also in Europe, in the French Alps and the Italian Dolomites. But by then I'd ridden Monte Zoncolan and L'Alpe d'Huez a number of times, and Col de Galibier and so on and so forth. And I was pretty darn keen on doing the best I possibly could on any and every climb I could. And wow, how to say this? I really became very intent on that. And it's great, it's good fun, but there's only so much you can do with it, because at the end of the day, it depends to quite a large extent on what other people do.
Right.
And a lot of the best cyclists, and if I can just mention one, there's a guy here in Melbourne who is, no question about it, emphatically a better, stronger cyclist than I am in the hills. He currently holds the age group com on Mount Everest with something like a 2-minute margin. He's 4 minutes faster than me, 4 minutes faster than me, Stefan Yuzipiv. And really, but he hasn't ridden L'Alpe d'Huez on Strava or Monte Zoncolan on Strava, but I mean, he would be able to absolutely smash my time on any and every climb that I've ever climbed if he did them. So I became sometime around about then or before, I became much more interested in doing things that had some sort of a metric that might be able to be exported to elsewhere in the world, or other climbers, cyclists might be able to use if they wanted to. And what it was, and I got the idea way back in Christchurch of doing, the idea started for me of trying to do 3,000 meters as fast as I could by doing hill repeats, because I'd by then ridden Mount Haleakala in Maui.
Okay, beautiful.
A few times on one trip. And I think my time on Maui is something like 3.5 hours, something like that. But of course, you can't just hop on a plane and go to Maui anytime you like. I can't. It burns a lot of fossil fuels. So I just thought, well, if you can't go to Maui, you've got to use what you've got. And so you can try and ride laps on a hill to get 3,000 meters and then see how fast you can do that. And I think in Christchurch, I got it done in about maybe 3 hours, 40 minutes. I can't remember. But by the time I was over the Everesting, I started to work out that actually this was a sort of a worthy objective. And soon after I finished the Ball Everesting ride, I did 3 laps of Melbourne's local steep hill test piece called Mars Gully Road. Mars Gully Road is, I think it's about 200 meters tall, maybe 204 meters tall. So 5 laps gives you 1,000 meters and 15 laps gives you the 3,000 meters, definitely. Okay. I went out there and I managed to get the 15 laps of Mars Gully Road in just under 3 hours. And I must say I was, apart from shattered, I was pretty pleased with that. And it did start to give me this idea of, what I call the big round numbers. So big round numbers are you've got to try and do 1,000 meters up and down in an hour. You've got to try and do 2,000 meters up and down in 2 hours. I'd already done the 3,000 meters in 3 hours. And I was hoping to see if I could do 4,000 meters in 4 hours. Well, it's not so easy, because
but it gets harder as you go up, right?
Well, it does get a lot harder as you go up. But the other thing is that you do need a steep hill, a very steep hill, in order to make for a very rapid rate of descent, which saves you time. But the problem really is that towards the end of these rides, and frankly at any time, climbing the steep gradients really takes it out of you. So I experimented on a few hills, including Terry's Avenue, where Tobias was later to set the world record for Everesting, which of course has now been bettered in recent months by all sorts of people, including Ronan McLaughlin most recently, if I can just give him his due. But I started experimenting with different hills, and in fact I went back to Hughes Street where I'd done the Everesting, which is actually very suitable, and I managed to get a good time for the 2,000 meters and then a good time for the 3,000 meters. So I did the 3,000 meters in about 2 hours 55. So then the psychology of it comes in. Well, if you can get the 3 hours done in 2 hours 55, what that really means is that for the 4,000 meter, you can actually afford to slow down.
So I love this idea of, would you call them the big round numbers? 1,000 in an hour, 2,000 in 2 hours. I mean, to me, that just feels like the stepping stones to get to the Everest. Or in my case here in Indiana, the highest thing in Indiana, I think, is 80 meters where we live. So it'll be a little bit challenging to get to the Everest, but that's a doable, trainable thing for people. And I are you seeing that also, or has that concept also begun to spread that you've seen? On Strava.
I've seen very little spread, mainly because, how to say this? For me, those big round numbers, and by the time I got to 4,000, I've only done the 4,000 once, and I can assure you, by the time I got to the end of the 4,000 in 4 hours, for me, little old me, I was by then 56. I was utterly shattered.
Yeah. I
mean, beyond belief. I couldn't even drive my car. I had to just rest for an hour before I could drive my car home. So I think that for folk who are preparing for an Everesting bike ride, I think that aiming for the big round numbers is perhaps a little bit ambitious, maybe. I think it's a great idea to do the elevation gain sessions, but I think it's important to get them done no matter how long they take you, rather than to aim to get them done in 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, which is very difficult. It's good training, but if it turns out that it takes you an hour and a half, 2.5 hours, 4 hours for the 3,000 or something like that, don't worry about the time, just get them done. Because I also think that for Everesting, to be honest, especially for newbies or people who want to just do the one once, goodness me, I mean, they're pretty big rides. I think that it's probably an advantage to get it done, no matter how long it takes you. And, unless you have a sense of the pacing that you've developed through your own first Everesting ride, I mean, really, you just don't know what it feels like to ride 3,000 meters when you've already ridden 6,000 meters.
Right.
Right.
So
in fact, I was quite.
Have you used power, heart rate? What's your pacing strategy been?
I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to power meters and heart rate monitors, mainly because I put my effort into being a bit of a weight weenie. I'm very much a weight weenie, so I don't have a power meter or a heart rate monitor. I had a heart rate monitor once, but I didn't really enjoy the experience. So for me, and that is probably why I did so many Everesting rides, to help me give me a sense of how slowly I had to go in the first half so that I could still keep going in the second half.
Got it.
I suppose the pro riders who know all about their power numbers and they've got a power meter and heart rate and all this kind of stuff, maybe they can, get the optimal pacing for themselves. And I'm very happy for them. But for me, unless it's contributing to my uphill progress, then as far as I'm concerned, if it has mass, leave it behind. I'm a weight weenie.
Yeah. So last week I spoke with Ronan McLaughlin, current holder as of the time that we're recording this. And, he's an interesting character because he is a coach, very in tune with his body. And he, really had a very detailed power strategy. The climb that he did was dead straight, 14% kicking to 24 at the end.
Saw that.
And he knew exactly if he would ride, 300 watts, and then for the last bit, he'd kick it to 370, make the turn. He knew, he had it like each lap had a bottle sitting at the top that he would take with the prescribed amount of nutrition. It's amazing to me to see. And I just love the, as time is, we've seen just in the last, since COVID, right? In the last 4 months, we've seen this whole event of Everesting really become so highly refined. And I think there's still a lot of ways to go. I look at when we put an hour record attempt together, the level of, that's months of planning with teams of people. So I think there's still so much out there, but I love, hearing you, is it better to weight weenie or better to have power? Well, it depends. It depends how much you know about your power and physiology.
Well, I don't really know much about this, but it's probably best to have both. I was a bit interested to read about Rowan McLaughlin's bike. Mm-hmm. But I must say, for myself, I had some slightly different ideas. For example, I know that for myself, on Hughes Street, where I both got the Everesting as well as got the 4,000 meters in 4 hours, I had to decelerate from about 80 kilometers an hour, something like that, down to slow enough to make a U-turn. Yeah. And on other, big round number bike rides that I've done on other hills, even in recent times where I still go, in the last few months, I've on 2 occasions gone for 2,000 meters on local hills, not in brilliant times, but you do need to have very, very strong front brake, very strong front brake so that you can decelerate at the maximum rate. And for me, very powerful braking on the front wheel is associated with being in the drops, which I noticed that Ronan didn't have. So I was a bit puzzled by that, I must say. But I mean, trust me, I'm not being critical of Ronan. I'm sure he knows vastly more than I do about what works for him. But powerful braking works for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important one. I think it's often overlooked, right? You think of what are the keys? It's lightweight. It's, you know, maybe some aerodynamics on the downhill. Oh, braking is a big deal.
Oh yeah. Whenever I do these steep hill lap sessions, I swap in an aluminium clincher for superior braking compared with a carbon rim.
Yeah.
That's just something, and I just don't know anything about power or heart rate. And for me, I try to, you know, on an Everesting ride, it's going back a bit for me now, but I try to actually go a little bit slow in the first 3,000 meters. And then in the second 3,000 meters, well, whether I want to or not, I'm going slowly. And for the last 3,000 meters, really, it's just right to survive and get it done.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of my pacing notes.
No, it's brilliant. How, I guess, give us some insight into, you know, what's it feel like? This is a hard question, I'm sure, to answer, but I mean, we look out and we see the world's best pro athletes doing this thing and competing in this thing that you invented. This is your thing. And all of a sudden it's, you know, as they say, 20 years later, it's an overnight success. Right? I mean, it took time, and then boom, it's the now.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm thrilled. You know, I really am thrilled because it is interesting. But I might just say that, Josh, you know, a few months ago, it was brought to my attention that a French cyclist whose name I forget. I'm sorry to him and your listeners for not knowing his name.
We'll look him up.
Off the top of my head.
Okay.
A French cyclist in 1984, somewhere in France, did the first Mount Everest-sized bike ride by riding laps on a hill, somewhere in France. I forget the name of the col. And his story, I heard him being interviewed on one or other cycling website. Great guy, great story. I think he's a physicist, and I think that after he had done his Everest-sized bike ride, he also did, which in my opinion is desperately impressive, he did an Everest-sized climb in a stairwell.
Oh, geez.
You know,
oh, my.
Laps on a stairwell, which I thought was also extremely impressive because he wanted to know whether he could go faster on the elevation gain in a stairwell compared with on a bike. And it turns out the stairwell won. So just, you know, before you give me all the credit, and thank you, please be aware that apparently I wasn't first. But yeah, it's a big thrill that it is now getting a bit of fame and attention. I'm very glad of that for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that I'm a big fan of Everesting bike rides because, I mean, they are really hard. You know, you can aspire to do an Everesting bike ride, and when you've done it, you feel pretty good about yourself. You know, it's a major achievement. So that's point one. Point two is that, you know, instead of burning all the fossil fuel and annual leave and money to go and climb Mount Everest, you can, as long as you've got a hill somewhere nearby and a bike, you know, you can do an Everesting bike ride. So I think that's a fantastic thing.
No, that's a brilliant point. That's a brilliant point.
It's a lot less damaging to the environment. And also, you know, compared with climbing Mount Everest, there's no risk transfer in the bike riding, really.
Right.
You take your own risk, and I mean, you know, compared with Everest, where the Sherpas end up shouldering a lot of the risk for the Western climbers by carrying loads through the ice fall. There's none of that in the cycling version. The cycling version, it's different. It's different to compare. Difficult to compare an orange to an apple, but I do like the bike riding thing. Yeah.
Just brilliant. Well, your story is so inspiring, and I've so enjoyed talking to you. I'm sure our listeners are going to absolutely fill the inbox with questions on this one and comments. So for all of our listeners out there, remember, leave your questions and comments below. Please like, please share this amazing story. And George Mallory, this has absolutely been a thrill talking with you today.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
And stay safe.